Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our 1-hour webinar. Our focus today is going to be on the normative update for the KABC II. And we'll describe the normative update for the KABC II, and Pearson will publish the normative update in 2018. Also, we'll describe the dual theoretical approach to interpretation that is offered by the KABC II, the approach that allows us as clinicians to identify an examinee's cognitive strengths and weaknesses. In terms of the agenda today, we're going to start by providing an overview of the KABC II NU. Then we'll talk about the need for the normative update. We'll provide some information on standardization and technical properties. And we'll conclude the webinar by looking at that dual theoretical approach that we use to identify cognitive strengths and weaknesses. So let me get started then by asking you first, before I begin with the content, if you use currently or if you have used the KABC II, and if you would choose either yes or no, and then click Submit. Okay, and I'll just give this a second for the responses to come through. Okay, looks like we're up there. Okay, most of you are familiar with the KABC II. I think some of this is going to be overview information. So those of you who are not familiar with the KABC II, hopefully you'll get an idea of how the tool works, the purpose for which it was designed, and that dual theoretical approach to interpretation that I described. Okay, thank you very much. It seems like most of you are familiar with the KABC II. Okay, so you're familiar with the KABC II, and even those of you who are not, I think from the name itself, the Kaufman Assessment Battery for Children, the second edition, you probably have the idea that the authors are probably named Kaufman. So Drs. Alan and Nadine Kaufman are the authors of the original KBC as well as the subsequent revision, the KBC II. Both have been at Yale University's Child Study Center in the School of Medicine since 1997. And if you're familiar with the work of the Kaufmans, certainly you're familiar with some of their other assessments, one of which is the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement. So what is the KABC II NU? Well, the KABC II NU, or the KABC II normative update, actually updates the normative data for the KABC II. And the KABC II itself is described as a culturally fair, individually administered test of cognitive ability. The test was published in 2004, and the normative update will be published in March 2018, here in the next few days. Just to provide an overview of the KABC II NU, the test is used with children and adolescents between the ages of 3 years and 18 years. The individuals or professionals with high level of expertise in test interpretation can administer and interpret the tool. The administration is in paper and pencil format, and scoring can be done manually using tables provided in the manual. You can also use web-based scoring using Pearson's Q Global scoring platform. So that provides just a brief overview of the features of the KABC II NU. So why did we need a normative update? Well, I think I mentioned that the KABC II was published in 2004, which is about 14 years ago now. And the need for a normative update was informed by several factors. An important factor would be the changes in U.S. demographics, changes in curriculum, changes in educational practices. We know that population demographics, curricula, educational practices have changed over time, which means that if we use older normative samples or the norms from the older normative samples, what we're doing effectively is introducing systematic error into the diagnostic process. And introducing error into the diagnostic process certainly will negatively influence whatever decisions we make, whether we're thinking about classification, eligibility determination, and so on. So the KABC II NU provides updated normative information for the KABC II, and the sample would be present day or current sample of children and adolescents. But in addition to those changes in population demographics, technology also has changed since 2004. Technology now is deeply integrated into the fabric of American daily life, and rapid innovations in technology certainly are evident when we think about changes in curricula, when we think about changes in educational planning. So the new KABC II NU, the normative updates or the new normative information reflects the changes that have occurred within the U.S. population demographics, within educational policies over the past 14 years since the publication of the KABC II. But in addition to changes in demographics, changes in technology, one of the things that is really important is to consider that research indicates that when we use older norms, we are likely to produce inflated scores on measures of intelligence. So the Flynn effect, or the impact of the Flynn effect, really looks at this consistent pattern of change that tends to occur in human intelligence over time. And researchers have noted that from the moment a test is published, what starts to happen is that there begins to develop a gap between the norms and the true intellectual level of the population. And that gap tends to continue to widen until we establish new norms. So it's really important to think about the impact of the Flynn effect, that cognitive tests with older norms may yield IQs and other index scores that might be spuriously high, if you will. And this inflation of scores becomes more pronounced as the norms become progressively or increasingly outdated. So it's important for us to think about updating the norms to mitigate the impact of the Flynn effect. So these are some of the factors that led to the need for this normative update. But in terms of the content of the KABC II, the materials for the KABC II, for the most part, will be the same materials that you use for the KABC II. So the easels, the manual, the stimulus, and manipulative materials are going to be exactly the same as you're familiar with, those of you who are familiar with the KABC II. Now, in terms of the record forms, and I hope most of you received the handout, I added this little asterisk after I distributed the handout earlier today. But in terms of the record forms, there will be a new record form for the KABC II NU, the KABC II NU record form. However, the changes on this record form compared to the record form for the KABC II will impact scoring and not the administration. So I know sometimes we tend to have a number of record forms in our storage areas, and certainly you can continue to use those, but there will be a new record form available for the KABC II NU. In addition, the part that you need, in addition to the materials for the KABC II, will be the KABC II NU Normative Update Manual Supplement. And if you're going to be using manual scoring, the tables that you need will be in this manual supplement. If you're using Q Global scoring, certainly you will be able to enter the raw scores into the scoring program. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly, and this is going to take us to a discussion of that dual theoretical approach to interpretation. I want to take a few minutes to look at the structure of the KABC II. So the KBC2 consists of 18 subtests, and those 18 subtests are used to create 3 age-based core batteries. And those 3 age-based core batteries vary slightly in terms of the subtest composition as well as the composition of the scales. So when you look over here, for example, ages 3 through 18, across the age range, the data from the KBC2 will yield 3 global scales: a fluid crystallized index, FCI, a mental processing index, MPI, and a nonverbal index, NVI. Now, for your youngest in this standardization sample, age 3, these are the only global scales scores that you'll be able to derive. For 3-year-olds, we only offer, or the KBC2 provides 3 global scale scores, those 3 indices. For other children, ages 4 through 18, and I want to separate ages 4 through 18 into one smaller group, ages 4 through 6, and then ages 7 through 18. For young children, ages 4 through 6, you will be able to generate your 3 global scores, and in addition to your 3 global scores, you're able to generate 4 scale scores: sequential or GSM, simultaneous or GV, learning or GLR, knowledge or GC, and you will certainly recognize those G factors if you're familiar with CHC or Cattell-Horn Carroll theory. So for children between ages 4 and 6, you'll get information for those 4 first scales, and for the oldest, ages 7 through 18, you'll get information for those first 4 scales in addition to the 5th, which is planning or GF. So the battery administered to children and adolescents between the ages of 7 and 18 years includes planning, because planning provides a comprehensive measure of higher level fluid reasoning skills that tend to emerge more prominently during the school age years. So I'm going to talk more about these global scales and then your other scales, sequential, simultaneous, learning, knowledge, and planning, when we look at the dual theoretical approach to interpretation. So let me say a few words about the dual theoretical foundation of the KBC2 scales and the global scales. So I mentioned that the KBC2 offers 5 scales. These are over here: sequential, GSM, simultaneous, GV, learning, GLR, planning, GF, and then knowledge, GC. In terms of CHC theory, the sequential scale on the KBC2 is a measure of short-term memory. Simultaneous is a measure of visual processing. Learning measures long-term storage and retrieval, or GLR. Planning measures fluid reasoning, and knowledge loads on crystallized ability. When you think about the KBC tools in relation to the Lurian approach, you'll notice that sequential on the KBC2 is called sequential processing, simultaneous processing, learning ability, and planning ability. What I want to illustrate here is when you look at the Lurian approach, and I want to use this information here to differentiate the information derived using the Lurian approach compared to the CHC approach. When you look at the Lurian approach, notice that these 4 scales will yield your global scale, the mental processing index. And notice that the mental processing index is comprised of sequential, simultaneous, learning ability, and planning ability. For your CHC approach, notice that you'll be able to derive a global scale, and that global scale is the fluid crystallized index, or FCI. And notice that the scales that contribute to that global scale include the 4 that contribute to the MPI over here for Luria: short-term memory, visual processing, long-term storage and retrieval, fluid reasoning, as well as crystallized ability. So what distinguishes the Lurian approach from the CHC approach is really the subtests or the tests that measure crystallized ability or acquired knowledge. So that distinction, I think, is going to be important when you think about the fact that one of the distinguishing features of the KBC2 is the flexibility that the clinician has to choose to use either the Lurian approach to interpretation or the CHC approach to interpretation. And of course, what's going to distinguish those 2 approaches will be crystallized ability, the extent to which we believe that crystallized ability will provide important information that will help us to determine a child's needs for maybe direct specialized instruction or maybe any early intervening services, or whether or not we believe that including a measure of crystallized ability actually might not be as much a measure of cognitive factors or might be affected by maybe non-cognitive factors, conceivably such as acculturation or maybe English proficiency or cognitive academic language proficiency when we think about the English language. So I want us to think about the distinction between the Lurian approach and the CHC approach, because it's really going to help us to start thinking about the approach that we want to use based on the child with whom we're working based on the referral concern. So I want to say a few words about the updated theoretical foundations. And when you think about the updated theoretical foundations, I mentioned CHC, and certainly Cattell-Horn Carroll, the psychometric theory of cognitive abilities, has been around for a number of years, as we all know. But I mentioned that the KBC2 is grounded in these 2 theoretical models. So at the time that the KBC2 was published, the CHC theory included 10 broad factors with approximately 70 narrow abilities. And over the years, CHC theory has been refined, and the last iteration around 2015, when you look at CHC theory, we tend to refer to 10 broad abilities and about 35 narrow abilities. Still, when you think about a number of broad abilities, the number of narrow abilities captured by CHC theory, it's important to keep in mind that the precise number really seems to depend on the perspective and preferences of different researchers. When you think about Luria's neuropsychological theory of processing, certainly research in neuroscience over the years has identified a number of psychological processes that tend to be fundamental to learning. So when we think about using a measure like the KBC2, it's because we're trying to understand conceivably why a child might be struggling in the learning environment, in the school environment. So when you think about Lurian theory, there are a number of psychological processes theoretically that are fundamental to learning. And I'll talk a bit more about these later, but you're thinking about processes like attention. It's important for us to pay attention in order to take in information or to receive information. Auditory processing is another important one. Certainly fluid reasoning is important. Long-term memory, being able to retrieve information from long-term storage. If I ask what does magnificent mean, for example, then you need to be able to retrieve the definition from long-term memory. You think about maybe processing speed. I want you to process information with relative speed, because then you're able to reserve more of your cognitive resources for performing complex tasks, and then also visual spatial processing, and how about working memory. Pretty much everything that children learn is learned within a working memory environment. So when you think about the Lurian approach, you're thinking about psychological processes that are fundamental to learning academic skills. So if you think about the information processing approach, for example, and you think about maybe at the input phase, what psychological processes are important in order for me to receive information and understand what you're asking or understand what I'm reading? What psychological processes are important for me to process that information, to retrieve the information from long-term storage? And then finally, at the output phase, what psychological processes are important at that phase in order for me to respond, whether verbally or maybe using some fine motor integration skills. So when you think about the KBC2, you're thinking about these two theoretical approaches, but one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that these are not separate and distinct, right? So when you think about CHC theory, for example, and you're thinking maybe about learning and remembering, or GLR, long-term retrieving information from long-term storage, are there some of those neuropsychological processes in the Lurian model that are consistent with GLR? So if you read the work, for example, I think an example I'm going to give you, there are multiple, but maybe Essentials of Cross-Battery Assessment, one of the things that the authors strive to do is really to make the connections between these different approaches, for example, CHC and Luria. So when you think about the dual theoretical approach, certainly we're using all of that information, whatever approach we decide to use, and we'll make that decision on the front end based on the referral concerns. Whatever we decide to do, it's because we're working with children in maybe a school setting, and we're trying to identify what they will need. We're trying to identify the supports that they will need in order to succeed in the academic environment. So maybe they need direct specialized instruction because of a specific learning disability, for example. Maybe I use a pattern of strengths and weaknesses analysis or cognitive hypothesis testing as part of my SLD identification. Maybe I'm working with children whose performance is at the high end of the distribution of scores, children who might need differentiated instruction because they learn at a faster rate than we present the information. Maybe we're working with young children. And then toward the end, I'm going to say something about culturally and linguistically diverse groups. So when you think about students who may not yet have acculturated to U.S. schools and the U.S. educational system, and who may speak a language other than English, how would the KBC2, how would that dual theoretical approach actually allow you to get the information that you need to describe the cognitive functioning of culturally and linguistically diverse students, being able to tease out some of those non-cognitive factors that could potentially impact performance on these cognitive tasks. And that's where I think the distinction is going to come between the MPI and the FCI. So in terms of the administration of the subtests on the KABC II NU, the content and the structure of the KABC II NU remains identical to those of the KABC II. So in order to administer the subtest, in order to determine the administration rules, start points, discontinue rules, time bonuses, and so on, you will consult the manual for the KABC II. So the manual for the KABC II NU, that supplement, will provide the additional information related to the normative update, but the actual administration directions will be in the KABC II manual. So just a few words about the norm sample. The normative information for the normative update is based on a national sample of 700 children and adolescents. The data were collected in 2017 between January and July, and the sample is representative of the U.S. English-speaking population between the ages of 3 and 18, the ages for which this test was designed. I think the standardization sample also included a number of cases that were collected as part of the standardization for the KTA-3, the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, and the WISC-5, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. And as always, we used a stratified sampling plan to make sure that the normative sample included representative proportions of children according to selected demographic variables. So we typically tend to include demographic variables such as age, gender, race, ethnicity, parent education level. Certainly geographic region is an important stratification variable as well. In terms of the norm sample, we also included representative proportions of children from various special education classifications, for example, intellectual disability, gifted and talented, ADHD, SLD, speech-language impairment, all the ones listed here. In terms of the reliability, the reliabilities of the global scale indices down here at the bottom, the MPI, the FCI, and the NVI, are quite high. Notice for ages 3 through 6 and 7 through 18. Notice the coefficients, some in the high 90s, some in the mid-90s. And at the scale level, you also notice that the coefficients are in the 90s. So in general, when you look at these reliability coefficients, they are at least as high as the reliability coefficients on the original KABC II, and in some cases they are higher, and that supports the consistency of the instrument over time. In terms of validity, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind when you think about the evidence for validity is that the data for the KABC II NU were collected using the original KABC II materials. So there were no changes to either the test content or the structure. So it's important when we think about validity to think about evidence based on the internal structure of the KABC II as well as evidence based on relations with other variables. And certainly we want to make sure that we have evidence comparing KABC II with KBC, also with other measures that measure similar cognitive constructs, and then the link between the cognitive measure and an academic measure. And you can refer to specific information in the manual supplement. Okie dokie. All right. There are some questions that are coming through. I'm going to work through some of this, and if I have a few minutes toward the end, I'll look at some of the questions. Otherwise, I'll respond to those questions via email. But I want to spend some time now thinking about the theoretical approaches to interpretation, because it is the theoretical approach to interpretation that will allow us to identify a pattern of strengths and weaknesses, if you will, to engage or to perform that cognitive hypothesis testing. So if I look at CHC theory and the KABC II NU, I mentioned that CHC theory is talked about a number of broad abilities, a number of narrow abilities, and the number really seems to depend on the preferences of the researchers. But one of the things that